Margaret had always believed that the greatest gift a parent could give was unconditional love. For more than 25 years, she had devoted her life to her son, Daniel. After her husband passed away when Daniel was still a child, Margaret took on every responsibility alone. She worked long hours, skipped countless personal pleasures, and made sacrifice after sacrifice to ensure that her son never felt the absence of opportunities. There were years when money was tight. Margaret often worked overtime and accepted extra shifts, returning home exhausted late at night. Yet she never complained. Every dollar she earned seemed to find its way toward Daniel's needs: school supplies, sports equipment, college tuition, and eventually the down payment on his first apartment. Seeing him succeed was all the reward she ever needed. As Daniel grew older, their relationship remained close. He called her regularly, visited on weekends, and often thanked her for everything she had done. Margaret felt proud of the kind, thoughtful man he had become. When he introduced Sophia to her 3 years earlier, she welcomed the young woman with open arms. Sophia was charming, ambitious, and confident. Margaret did her best to make her feel like part of the family from the beginning. She invited her to holiday dinners, remembered her birthday, and even helped her when she was between jobs. Whenever Daniel and Sophia faced financial difficulties, Margaret quietly stepped in to help. She never kept score. In her mind, family helped family. As the couple's relationship became more serious, Margaret naturally assumed she would be involved in their future wedding plans. She often imagined the day with excitement. It wasn't about being the center of attention. She simply wanted to witness one of the most important moments of her son's life. For months, she occasionally asked Daniel how things were going between him and Sophia. He would smile and say everything was wonderful. When she hinted about wedding plans, he usually laughed and changed the subject. Margaret assumed they were still deciding on details and didn't think much of it. Then one Saturday afternoon, she invited the couple over for lunch. The atmosphere seemed perfectly normal. They sat around her dining table, sharing stories and enjoying a homemade meal. Margaret felt happy seeing them together. During dessert, she smiled and asked a simple question. "So, have you two picked a wedding date yet?" The room suddenly became quiet. Daniel glanced at Sophia. Sophia looked back at him. For a brief moment, Margaret sensed something strange pass between them. Then Sophia smiled. "Oh, we got married yesterday." Margaret blinked. For a second, she wondered if she had misunderstood. "Yesterday?" she asked softly. "Yes," Sophia replied casually. "It was a very small ceremony." Margaret's heart began to race. "A ceremony?" she repeated. "You mean you're already married?" Sophia nodded. "Just a few close people attended. We wanted something intimate, just for special people." The words landed heavily. Just for special people. Margaret stared at her, unable to process what she had heard. She felt as if the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely her son would explain. She turned toward Daniel. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes. "Daniel," she said quietly. Her son shifted in his chair. "We wanted to keep it simple, Mom." That was all he said. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of how painful this moment might be. Margaret forced a small smile, though her chest ached. "I see," she whispered. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. She heard conversations, but barely registered the words. Her mind replayed the same sentence over and over, just for special people. After they left, Margaret sat alone in her quiet house. Every room seemed unusually empty. She looked at the family photographs lining the walls, the birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, holidays, and countless memories she had spent decades creating. She remembered comforting Daniel after childhood disappointments, helping him study for exams, and celebrating every milestone in his life. She remembered being there whenever he needed her. Yet somehow, when the most important day of his adult life arrived, she had not been considered important enough to attend. Tears slowly filled her eyes. The pain wasn't because she had missed a wedding. It was because, for the first time in her life, she felt invisible to the people she loved most. As evening settled outside her window, Margaret realized something had changed. The hurt ran deeper than disappointment. It was the painful discovery that years of sacrifice and devotion did not always guarantee appreciation. And although she didn't know it yet, that heartbreaking afternoon would become the beginning of a lesson none of them would ever forget. The days following that lunch felt unusually quiet for Margaret. Normally, she would call Daniel every few days just to check in, ask how work was going, or hear about whatever was happening in his life. This time, however, she found herself staring at her phone and putting it back down. She wasn't angry in the way people often imagined anger. She wasn't plotting revenge or hoping for an argument. What she felt was something far heavier, sadness mixed with disappointment. The memory of Sophia's words continued to echo in her mind, just for special people. The phrase seemed impossible to forget. Margaret tried to convince herself that perhaps she was overreacting. Maybe the couple had their reasons. Maybe they wanted privacy. Maybe they simply made a poor decision without realizing how deeply it would hurt her. But every time she thought about it, another question appeared. If they truly wanted a private ceremony, why invite other people and not her? The more she reflected on it, the more painful the exclusion became. A few days later, she noticed photographs from the wedding on social media. A friend had innocently mentioned seeing them online and congratulated her on her son's marriage. Margaret forced a smile and thanked the woman. Afterward, curiosity got the better of her. She opened the photos. There was Daniel standing beside Sophia, both smiling brightly. Around them stood friends, cousins, co-workers, and even a few distant relatives. Margaret stared at the screen. The ceremony hadn't been as private as she had been led to believe. There were dozens of guests. People she barely knew had been invited. Yet she, the woman who had raised Daniel alone and supported him through every stage of life, had not been there. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to cry, not because of the wedding itself, but because of what it represented. The exclusion felt intentional. When the tears finally stopped, she made a decision. She would stop chasing people who didn't value her presence. For years, Margaret had placed everyone else's needs before her own. Whenever Daniel needed help with a bill, she was there. Whenever Sophia needed assistance, Margaret stepped in without hesitation. If their rent was due and money was tight, she helped. If unexpected expenses appeared, she found a way to contribute. She never expected repayment, but she had expected respect. As the week continued, Margaret began focusing on herself in ways she hadn't done for years. She accepted an invitation from an old friend for coffee. She joined a local book club she had been considering for months. She started taking evening walks through the neighborhood instead of spending every free moment worrying about other people's problems. To her surprise, these small changes brought a sense of peace. The world didn't fall apart because she wasn't constantly available. Daniel and Sophia rarely contacted her during that week. When they did send messages, they were brief and casual, as if nothing significant had happened. Neither mentioned the wedding. Neither apologized. Neither asked how she felt. That silence spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, Margaret began reviewing her finances. For years, she had quietly transferred money whenever the young couple needed assistance. Looking through her records, she was surprised by how much she had contributed over time. There had been deposits for utility bills, deposits for car repairs, deposits for rent, deposits for emergencies. The amounts were never small. She realized she had spent years acting as a safety net, always ready to catch them whenever they stumbled. Yet when they celebrated one of the happiest moments of their lives, she had not even received an invitation. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. As the week progressed, Margaret felt her perspective changing. She still loved her son deeply. Nothing could erase that. But love did not require accepting disrespect. Support did not mean allowing herself to be taken for granted. For the first time in many years, she began establishing emotional boundaries. If Daniel wanted a relationship with her, he would need to participate in it. If Sophia wanted kindness, she would need to show some in return. Margaret wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't interested in teaching lessons or making dramatic speeches. She simply decided that her generosity would no longer be automatic. Respect had to flow both ways. By the end of the week, she felt stronger than she had since learning about the wedding. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. What she didn't know was that very soon, a single phone call would reveal exactly how Daniel and Sophia viewed her role in their lives, and that conversation would change everything. A week after the wedding revelation, Margaret was sitting comfortably in her living room, enjoying a quiet afternoon with a book she had recently started. Sunlight filtered through the windows, and for the first time in days, she felt genuinely at peace. The hurt of being excluded from Daniel's wedding still lingered, but she had begun to accept that some disappointments could not be undone. Her phone suddenly rang. She glanced at the screen. Sophia. Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Sophia." There was no greeting on the other end, no small talk, no inquiry about how Margaret was doing. Instead, Sophia's voice sounded tense and impatient. "The rent is overdue." Margaret remained silent. Sophia continued, "Did you transfer it?" For a few seconds, Margaret simply listened. The question itself wasn't surprising. Over the past few years, she had received similar calls many times. Whenever Daniel and Sophia found themselves short on money, Margaret usually stepped in without hesitation. She had covered rent payments before, often without even being asked twice. But something felt different now. The wedding had changed everything. As Margaret sat quietly, she realized that Sophia had not once mentioned the hurtful conversation from the previous week. There was no acknowledgement of the wedding, no apology, no sign that she understood how painful her words had been. The first communication after excluding Margaret from one of the most important days in the family wasn't an expression of regret. It was a request for money. Sophia spoke again. "Margaret, are you there?" "Yes," Margaret replied calmly. "Well?" Sophia asked. "Did you send the rent payment?" Margaret closed her book and placed it on the table beside her. Then she spoke in a steady voice. "Didn't I tell you?" There was confusion on the other end. "Tell me what?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I thought it was clear." Sophia sounded impatient. "I don't understand what you're talking about." Margaret took a slow breath. "For years, I've helped whenever you and Daniel needed support. I've paid bills, covered emergencies, and helped with rent more times than I can count." "Yes," Sophia replied, "and we appreciate that." The words sounded automatic rather than sincere. Margaret continued, "But last week I learned that my son's wedding happened without me." Silence. She went on. "I wasn't invited. I wasn't informed. I wasn't even told it was happening." Sophia didn't respond. Margaret remembered the exact words she had heard. "Just for special people. That's what you said." The silence grew heavier. Finally, Sophia spoke. "We wanted a small ceremony." Margaret nodded, even though Sophia couldn't see her. "I understand that explanation. What I don't understand is why there were dozens of guests in the photographs." Sophia hesitated. Margaret continued calmly. "I saw friends, co-workers, and relatives. It wasn't a secret wedding. It wasn't just the two of you." There was another uncomfortable pause. Sophia's voice softened slightly. "Margaret, that's not what this is about right now. The rent is due." The statement surprised Margaret. Even now, Sophia seemed more concerned about the payment than the relationship. Margaret felt a strange sense of clarity. For years, she had convinced herself that her generosity was appreciated. Perhaps parts of it were. But in that moment, she realized that her support had become expected rather than valued. She answered gently, "Actually, it is what this is about." "What do you mean?" "I mean relationships matter. Respect matters." Sophia sighed. "So you're refusing to help because of the wedding?" Margaret thought carefully before responding. "No." The answer caught Sophia off guard. "I'm refusing because I've realized something." "And what's that?" Margaret looked around her quiet home. "I've spent years showing up for both of you whenever you needed me. But when it mattered most, neither of you showed up for me." Sophia didn't answer. A few moments later, another call appeared on Margaret's phone. Daniel. Sophia had evidently ended the conversation and contacted him immediately. Margaret answered. "Hi, Daniel." His voice sounded frustrated. "Mom," Sophia said, "you're not helping with the rent." Margaret felt a familiar sadness. Not, "Mom, are you okay?" Not, "Mom, can we talk about what happened?" The first concern was money. She listened as Daniel explained their situation. Bills had piled up. They were short this month. They needed help. Margaret heard him out patiently. Then she asked a simple question. "Daniel, when were you planning to tell me about your wedding?" The line became quiet. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel admitted softly, "I don't know." That honest answer hurt more than any excuse could have. Margaret realized that excluding her hadn't been a last-minute mistake. It had been a conscious choice. And for the first time in years, she chose herself, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. The woman who had always rushed to rescue them was finally learning that kindness should never require accepting hurt in return. And as the conversation continued, Daniel was about to discover that some lessons cost far more than a month's rent. The conversation with Daniel ended far more quietly than it had begun. After Margaret explained how deeply she had been hurt, neither of them had much left to say. There were no dramatic arguments, no angry accusations, and no raised voices. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence filled with truths that had been ignored for too long. For the first time, Daniel seemed forced to look at the situation from his mother's perspective. Margaret ended the call politely and placed her phone on the table. Then she returned to her book. A strange feeling settled over her. Relief. Not because she enjoyed refusing help, but because she had finally spoken honestly. For years, she had buried her own feelings whenever they threatened to inconvenience someone else. Now she had chosen to acknowledge them. The following weeks were noticeably different. Daniel and Sophia did not call as often. When they did, the conversations were brief. Margaret suspected they were upset with her decision, but she refused to feel guilty. She had not abandoned them. She had simply stopped solving every problem for them. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophia faced challenges they had long avoided. Without Margaret's financial support, they had to examine their spending habits more carefully. They created a budget, cut unnecessary expenses, and found ways to manage their household income more effectively. Daniel accepted additional projects at work. Sophia picked up extra hours at her job. The adjustments were not easy. There were sacrifices involved. Weekend outings became less frequent. Impulse purchases disappeared. Every expense suddenly required consideration. For the first time since they had begun living together, they were fully responsible for their own financial decisions. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. They adapted. The difficulties that initially felt overwhelming gradually became manageable. They learned to plan ahead rather than relying on someone else to rescue them whenever money became tight. More importantly, Daniel found himself thinking about his mother more often. Not the version of her he had unconsciously taken for granted. The real woman. The woman who had worked long hours to provide for him. The woman who had never missed a school event. The woman who had supported him through college, career struggles, and countless challenges. The woman who had quietly helped him build the life he now enjoyed. One evening, while organizing old photographs, Daniel came across a picture from his graduation day. Margaret stood beside him, smiling proudly. He remembered how hard she had worked to make that moment possible. Then another memory surfaced. His first apartment, his first car, his first promotion. At every milestone, his mother had been there. Yet when his wedding day arrived, he had allowed her to become an outsider. The realization was painful. For weeks, he wrestled with feelings of guilt. Eventually, he sat down with Sophia and had a conversation they should have had months earlier. To her credit, Sophia listened. As they talked, she began to recognize her own mistakes as well. She had focused so much on creating the wedding she wanted that she had never stopped to consider how excluding Margaret would affect her. What had seemed like a simple decision at the time now looked very different. Together, they acknowledged something neither wanted to admit. They had hurt someone who had consistently supported them, and they had never properly apologized. A few weeks later, Margaret heard a knock at her front door. When she opened it, she found Daniel and Sophia standing outside. Daniel held a bouquet of flowers. Sophia carried a small box of pastries from Margaret's favorite bakery. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "Mom, can we come in?" Margaret nodded. The three of them sat together in the living room. The atmosphere felt nervous but sincere. Daniel looked at his hands before finally speaking. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they were genuine. He explained how much he regretted allowing the wedding to happen without her involvement. He admitted that he had taken her presence for granted. Sophia apologized as well. She acknowledged that her comment about special people had been thoughtless and hurtful. Hearing those words did not erase the pain completely. Some wounds take time to heal, but Margaret could see the sincerity in their faces. For the first time since the wedding, they seemed to truly understand what had happened. After listening quietly, Margaret smiled. "I appreciate the apology." Daniel looked relieved. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "I love both of you," she said, "and that was never the problem." The tension in the room finally began to fade. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking honestly, something they should have done much sooner. By the time they left, the relationship felt different. Not perfect, not exactly as it had been before, but healthier, stronger, built on clearer boundaries and deeper understanding. Margaret never resumed paying their rent or solving every financial problem. That chapter of her life had ended, and surprisingly, that was good for everyone. Daniel and Sophia learned responsibility. Margaret learned the importance of valuing her own feelings. In the end, the sweetest victory wasn't watching them struggle. It was watching them grow. The wedding she never attended became the lesson they all needed. A reminder that love should never be measured by money, and that genuine family relationships are built on respect, gratitude, and appreciation. Sometimes the most powerful response to being taken for granted is not revenge at all. It's quietly showing people what life looks like when your kindness is no longer something they can simply expect.